There we go. I think, yeah, we're recording now. So, all right, so third meeting.
Third meeting of Magic Mountain.
And this one, if I'm remembering right, goes from 94, the beginning of chapter 4, to 145.
Yeah, we end with the subsection in chapter 4 that we stopped is we did not read the subsection entitled Mounting Misgivings. So we stopped in the middle of chapter 4.
Right. I think
today.
Doubts and Considerations
Yes.
is the subchapter that we finished on
Yes.
within chapter 4. And then before we're done today, we'll check how far we want to go.
Yes.
Knowing that the schedule may be a little bit disrupted. You know,
We are in summer.
We'll figure out what we want to do with that. But
Yeah.
so we were saying before we started recording, we were saying we're both a little less prepared than we might have been.
Yeah.
As far as this goes, I mean, obviously this is partly just scheduling and other work and that kind of thing. But I think it's also a little bit about this section of reading. I think I think things. Well, I guess I'll just put my cards on the table. I think things heat up a little at the end, but there's a lot of just kind of pragmatic sort of moving the characters around that I think happen. I'll say this. This is my I'm going to open with a controversial take.
Okay.
Here we are, 145 pages in.
Yeah.
And I am not as impressed as I was hoping to be.
Okay.
At this point in the reading, and this is not to say that I think it's a bad book,
Right.
but I'm not extraordinarily. I find myself wondering a little bit, just what about this book has lent it such position? Because in a lot of ways, to me, it just feels like a pretty ordinary novel.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it, but I don't feel like it's doing anything all that different from a lot of the books that I've read over the years. And so maybe this is unfair, right? Because I'm comparing it to some pretty fantastic books.
Yeah.
But I've been a little bit underwhelmed, and I guess part of it is you wait till you're 50 to read a book that you've been hearing about for 30 years.
Right.
Maybe that's a problem in itself. Maybe that's on me. But for instance, we start off the necessary purchases.
Right.
In chapter 4, and these are the warm blankets for the balcony naps that are prescribed there at the sanatorium.
They did have in that part, I remember, the topsy-turvy weather. Like it's summer, but then it snows, and then it goes summer again. And I couldn't help but see that as a little bit of, I don't know if you considered it to be heavy-handed, I'm not sure.
I did.
But very allegorical on this level of like, well, it uses the word group topsy-turvy on the first page of today's reading. Nature suffered a sudden reserve. Everything turned topsy-turvy. And so again, we have this kind of dominant image pattern of what is up is down and what is down is up.
Right.
It may be that at the time of writing, this was fairly, this was part of the avant-garde modernist movement, though, and that because we're coming to it so late, we've read other texts that do it.
Right. Right. I mean, it could be the thing that feels kind of tired.
Yeah.
Is because everybody copied this. I don't know.
Yeah.
And there's also the question of it being in translation. Which I'm sure I'll bring up from time to time as a possible, kind of obstacle to my really recognizing the greatness. But I did think it was a little heavy-handed. I thought it was I think about this a lot actually. But one of my favorite, I instituted a rule in class years and years ago that nobody could invoke those heroic teacher models in anything.
Yeah.
Not in discussions, not in essays. No reference to Dead Poet Society.
Right.
No reference to Stand and Deliver, unless you want to talk about how Jaime Escalante's life was ruined by all of these things. But I do love the writing class sequence at the very beginning of Throw Mama from the Train. With Billy Crystal as the writing teacher, and there's this kind of full voice reading of students' work that's a submarine thriller.
Yeah.
Right? But she's had no experience. She's just some suburban person who's never had any real experience. And the story ends with something like and they pushed the thing that made the sub go down.
Right. Right.
And I felt like parts of this book for today's reading, parts of it felt a little bit just heavy that way.
Yeah.
Just kind of like a real slow wink, and then the weather got bad,
right,
and it was hard to see anything,
right,
and so I'm having a little bit of fun with this, but it did feel painted thick, and perhaps I would certainly entertain the argument that part of what we're supposed to be doing here is experiencing that same kind of weird stillness that Hans is experiencing. That may be part of the point of nothing is that it's nothing here. And I'm we're going to read the book, and maybe the value of this will become more clear to me. But for the moment, I'm kind of finding myself thinking, he might have benefited from a good editor who's just kind of like, maybe we don't need all of this.
Yeah, he had said in his preface that we talked about on day one, or in his foreword, on the bottom of the first page, he says, more than that, our story has of its own nature something of the legend about it now and again. We shall tell it at length, thoroughly, in detail. For when did a narrative seem too long or too short by reason of the actual time or space it took up? We do not fear being called meticulous, inclining as we do to the view that only the exhaustive can be truly interesting. Not all in a minute, then, will the narrator be finished with the story of our Hans. The 7 days of a week will not suffice, no, nor 7 months either. Best not too soon to make too plain how much mortal time must pass over his head while he sits spun round in his spell. Heaven forbid it should be 7 years. So, I don't know if he's kind of poking fun at the length of his own book in the foreword, or if he's justifying it, but, I guess a charitable reading would be that he's kind of doing both. Like, he's kind of winking at us and saying some version of, I know. And it is true that when you're in a hospital, and thankfully it's been a while since I've been in one, and I'm sure the same is true of sanatoria or of mental institutions, or even, the first big book we read as part of this project was Infinite Jest, and so much of that was taking place in a halfway house. And there may be some Thomas Mann influence on David Foster Wallace in terms of the halfway house, because it does feel like in those scenes in Infinite Jest, it's like they're just sitting on the couch smelling each other's farts, and like, what do you do? Like, it's just that we're not drinking is what we're doing. And
we're getting to that next day that's one day.
And so, it might be, like you say, that the point is that, okay, we're here, we're being still. But there were a couple of interesting things that I noticed. I mean, for example, about halfway through, when he gets the nosebleed, and before I get to this sequence where he remembers the boy he had a crush on, and clearly there's an homoerotic connection to Madame Chocotte, and I want to talk about that. But before I do, let me ask you this. Like, does it seem to you like he got sick because he was there? Or what? So, because he's bleeding out the nose and the mouth.
Yeah. So I'm we've kind of said before, but I'll say again. I'm kind of keeping this reading cold. And I've been busy. And the two things have kind of conspired to keep me from looking up as much as I might about tuberculosis. But there doesn't seem to be any sense of alarm that he's visiting, that he's a healthy person visiting there. There doesn't seem to be this sense of potential contagion. In this idea, and so on the one hand, it's hard to believe that, that nobody would say, like, well, be careful, don't get sick.
Right.
But it does also, obviously, these things happen. Now he's traveling, and in some ways traveling for the first time.
Right.
And he's changed altitude, he's changed all this. So, and it's just, I mean, I actually, I'll have to tell you later, I stumbled upon an Instagram account just yesterday that featured a ton of photos of our New Orleans trip. Years ago.
Oh yeah, I want to see
that. And so I was sort of intrigued by that. But one of the things that it made me think about, specifically in context of this, is how some of the discomfort that students had on that trip, that were just clearly like, I'm outside of my really, really familiar element, and there are sort of biological, just issues that go along with that. What's the old English term, chippy, the chippy tummy that you get from traveling, and that kind of thing. So it occurs to me that, like, something about this trip is to blame, but it feels, I mean, again, coming from a place of total medical ignorance, it feels unlikely to me that he has somehow caught what it is that has sent.
Yeah, I mean, he seems like all fucked up in this part of the book.
Yeah.
Like, not only does he go and then he has the very homoerotic memory of the boy, beginning on page 133. I guess Pribislav Hip.
Yeah.
And this guy is who Shaukat reminds him of, and the same thing with the pencil, which I invoked Van Halen last time, and I was kind of happy I did. It's like, the pencil's clearly phallic.
Right.
First he wanted a pencil, he wanted to deal in pencil with the boy. Now he's matured, I guess, into heterosexuality, and so he's thinking about Madame Shaukat and the pencil.
I guess. I mean, I think there's a lot to say about this.
And I'm sure we'll get to it.
Yeah.
But I want to get to this passage that's a little deeper on page 132 that I just would imagine opens itself up to a lot of what we're talking about now in terms of trans issues and in terms of ableism, I think, comes up. It's this long passage. I want to read it from 132 to 133. This is where he's at Kraskovsky's, or how do you pronounce it? Kraskovsky's lecture about how love is like disease. And he's looking at Shaukat's hand and her arm, and he says, he exclaims, "The way women dressed. They showed their necks and bosoms, they transfigured their arms by veiling them in illusion. They did so the world over to arouse our desire. Oh God, how beautiful life was." And this feels like pretty normal for a young man to be like, wow, women, they're amazing, It was just accepted commonplace that this made it beautiful, for it was commonplace that women dressed themselves alluringly. It was so well known and recognized a fact that we never consciously realized it, but merely enjoyed it without a thought. And yet he had an inward conviction that we ought to think about it, ought to realize what a blessed, well-nigh miraculous arrangement it was, and by a definite design that women were permitted to array themselves with irresistible allure for the perpetuation of the species. And so this is all, I think, very much this conservative and also conventional way of looking at, like, women. They make themselves attractive so that we'll want them, so that there will be more people, right? And then he says, but suppose a woman were inwardly diseased, unfit for motherhood, what then? What was the sense of her wearing gauze sleeves and attracting male attention to her physical parts if these were actually unsound? Obviously there was no sense. It ought to be considered immoral and forbidden as such. For a man to take an interest in a woman inwardly diseased had no more sense than the interest Hans had once taken in Pribislav Hip. And I think that is a really loaded paragraph. And I don't know if Thomas Mann is siding with Hans here or not, but somebody is putting forth the same argument that we see in terms of, like, today, when they're like, well, what is a woman, right? When we talk about trans women, it's like, well, she's not really a woman because she can't get pregnant.
Right.
And then many of us on the left in the discourse will say, okay, so when a woman has menopause, is she no longer a woman? Or what if she has a hysterectomy? Is she no longer a woman? And we have these sort of debates, that I think Mann might be anticipating. And so, like, what does a woman make?
Yeah.
And I guess the last thing I'll say to that is the business that it's immoral for her to try to attract men. These women to try to be sexy in this place is immoral because they're sick. Invokes some ableism, I think, that I'm would be shocked if somebody hasn't taken this passage to task in terms of disability studies, especially given, having come on the other end, I guess, of a pandemic.
Yeah.
But we've thought lots about AIDS in the 20th and 21st centuries, and we've thought about lots of other ways in which certain women, whether it's through fat studies, how dare she take pride in her appearance or try to be pretty because she's fat, or I think there's a lot of anti-feminist rhetoric right on the nose here, and I don't know if Mon is siding with him or not, but anyway, that's my big contribution for today.
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating sort of sequence. I think that it's really hard to read this without thinking about this earlier remembrance of Prislav.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot going on there, but for me it's less about the actual moment of the sanitarium and more about something that I think we talked about, I can't remember when, but earlier, about Hans himself, which is that he's a real country mouse.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing, I mean what this really, the bell this rang for me was not the stuff that you mentioned, although I think that this is all clearly ties in. But I found myself thinking a lot more of the sort of incel movement and the kind of cooked in misogyny that had to do with kind of like not just identity, but kind of like the expectations and the kind of I don't know the sense of entitlement, that he has been studying this woman, super closely for quite some time.
And now he's literally staring at her, seated right behind her, staring at her arm and her back, and
to be fair, right? Something I'm doing kind of on the side right now is kind of blasting through Big Mouth on Netflix, which I find like troubling in some ways and absolutely hilarious in others, and one of the things that I'm really intrigued by is this kind of moment where, these sort of two main characters, the two boys, they're deeply concerned about being decent human beings at the same time that they're just like, oh my God, girls.
Right.
And
well, that's difficult. That was difficult on me.
Well,
when I was young.
I want to agree with a footnote.
Yeah.
Which is that it's difficult because we're not well trained early enough.
Right.
To really, I've just reached the point where I'm blanking on his name. The little one, the John Mulaney guy who has the ghost of Duke Ellington living in his attic.
Right.
And he's like interested in this girl who has physically blossomed over the summer or whatever, and but he's genuinely interested. Like he finds her just funny, and he really just wants to hang out with her, and he's asking Duke Ellington's ghost for advice, and up to this point the advice has been terrible, always terrible.
Right.
But Ellington says he like surprises the whole room with this like fantastic advice, right? Yeah. He goes, I've always found that, and the fact that it's Jordan Peele, by the way,
right,
really, I've always found that what women want is to be treated like human beings, and the kid's like, what?
Yeah.
And there's all this kind of, all of this is tongue in cheek, at the same time that it's fairly serious, and I think Hans is like struggling in this kind of, Victorian-ish world, with a lot of these sort of like baked-in misogynies and these baked-in expectations.
And the incel movement is on point because so far we have no sense that Shokot has noticed him at all.
Right.
So that's like my understanding of like the Reddit threads and the incel threads in general. The frustration is, I'm putting all this focus on you, and you didn't even see me at all.
Right.
And that seems to be what's happened so far. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
There may be some revelation that Chilcott knows who he is.
Right.
But,
and there's some room.
Yeah.
You know, to see Hans in a better light, I think.
Yes.
You know, I mean, part of it is he's deeply inexperienced and he's way out of his depth, and and this is going to be, I guess, the fullest throated sort of defense I will offer for this like fairly offensive, you know, kind of thing here. Is I think that he is like one notch away from full blown panic. You know, this is a kind of 3 alarm. Like, he is feeling feelings he's never felt before. He's feeling them in a foreign place. He's feeling them while he's having these physical difficulties that extend beyond the bleeding.
Right.
He's got the red face.
The
his
headaches.
head is shaking.
Yeah.
You know, he's having all of these kind of issues, and so I feel like in some ways he is just completely overwhelmed, and I kind of want to you know. I kind of want to cut him some slack, and the assumption that I'm using for the moment is that, as we sometimes do, in this moment where he just doesn't know what to do, he is falling back on the easy script that he's heard before. You know, I mean, this sounds very much like, I don't know if you have this experience, but this sounds very much to me like when, you know, when a 17-year-old student in my class makes an argument about, you know, equal opportunity employment, that is obviously, you know, this regurgitation of something that they heard from their parents or grandparents. That even includes these kind of experiences that they couldn't possibly have had.
Right.
You know, that is this, you know, that this generationally, you know, time stamped. And so, you know, I think in this way that I don't want to let him off the hook entirely, but I will say I think what he's doing here is in this moment of really like tailspin. He is grasping for like the thing that he knows how to grab onto, and it is something that he's no doubt heard in this like male world of his, either from the university or from
his grandfather.
These all-male
his grandfather
households.
was extremely conservative.
Right. These and these households that were so male. That were so, there's no mother, there's no grandmother. You know, there's no sisters. And so this kind of like, you know, I think of it as kind of like the upholstered chair, like dude, you know, men's club kind of world, you know, where there's just like, well, you know how they are, you know, they dress it up, but you can't really tell the truth, you know.
And I mean, I would add to that, you know, I would let Mon off the hook maybe even more than Hans, because, you know, Mon clearly is trying to paint a sensual picture of that concert.
Yeah.
Like when, you know, Mon is not saying sick women can't be hot.
Right.
He's definitely not saying that, because the men and women both are being sexy.
Right.
They may be sick. Some of them may be dying, but there is no doubt that he's trying to paint a sensual picture at that ball. Right. Like he goes at length about how they're dressed. He talks about how they look at each other and touch each other and talk. So Hans might think it's weird, but I think the novelist standing apart is like, you don't have to be able to have a baby to be able to turn the light switch on.
Yeah,
you know?
I think what we're supposed to understand here is that this is Hans encountering real, normal, natural, you know, sensuality in this way that he's just not prepared for.
Right.
You know, and I think I've used this metaphor before, but you know, he's the homeschool kid who's like suddenly in a dorm, going like you're doing what? You know,
and what do you make of the boy from school that he remembers?
So this for me is where this reading for today gets really interesting, because it's fundamentally hard to figure out, but it's obviously really important in this way that feels real to me. And I think it starts on 122.
Okay.
The last paragraph there. He's been troubled for 100 pages now about why this girl feels familiar.
Right.
This woman reminds me of some,
Yes.
and it's like, and it's got, all the trappings of this kind of repressed Freudian, sort of thing.
Especially given that Kurkowski's a Freudian and he's talking about love and repression and sickness.
Yeah. And this leads to the one, I think, really, really solid punchline, which I'll get to in just a little bit. But so he finally hits him, right? And I think it's worth looking at, like, how he gets there, right?
Yeah.
And he has the nosebleed on 122, right?
Yeah.
Violent and persistent. This is about the middle of the page.
Yeah.
Taking to staunch it nearly half an hour of going to and fro between bench and brook, snuffing water up his nostrils, rinsing his handkerchief, and lying flat on his back. I don't know about you. This is maybe my own country mouseness, but as a kid, as a teenager, I had spontaneous nosebleeds all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I've grown up with the idea that this is like part of like male puberty. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think, I don't know. Well, you've got boys about that age. Do they get nosebleeds?
One of them gets nosebleeds commonly enough to where I would say yes. Yeah.
So to me, this feels like kind of that. It has these, I think, unavoidable kind of reverberations, though, right? Mm-hmm. There's the tubercular, like, is he sick?
Right.
In that. But then there's also this kind of, female puberty, like this appearance of blood as a kind of sexual maturity, this kind of thing. It's also about a kind of fragility, a kind of vulnerability, right? And so it has all of these kind of facets that I think are really interesting. But there's something about that, right? That finally brings this memory home, right? He felt no unpleasant sensation. The bloodletting had a soothing effect, but he found himself in a state of extraordinarily reduced vitality, which has been kind of the story. The whole thing.
It's like, once again, you're tired.
So that when he exhaled the air, he felt no need to draw it in again, and lay there, moveless for the space of several quiet heartbeats before taking in another slow superficial breath. Quite suddenly, he found himself in the far distant past.
That's right.
And
transported.
So there's something about being helpless.
Yeah.
Right? There's something about being so passive that even inhaling feels like it's a lot.
Yeah.
And that brings this memory back, and it happened when he was a lad of 13. I think you could have taken this phrase and just put it on a piece of paper all by itself. It happened when he was a lad of 13. And I would have given pretty good odds that this had something to do with gay panic. I don't know why.
But
there's something about that
it
phrase.
Happened, yes.
It's just like, we all went to summer camp, kids.
Yes.
But this clearly, right? That what's going on here is he admires this kid, right? He's a good student. He's about the same age, but he's a whole grade ahead. And he's exotic. He has this like Kyrgyzstan. They even kind of nickname him. He has this kind of ethnic.
The Kyrgyz.
Yeah, he's got this kind of ethnic exotic something. He's and this is probably not a very this is probably like a little too particular to be whatever, but the really good looking gay guy who was my neighbor in the dorms for a little while was often in like tan pants and a blue jacket,
Right.
And so I found myself really being like, who didn't like Trey?
Yes,
yes. And so this idea that Hans is kind of like he's wrapped up in like all the things this guy is, right? He's a good student. He's good looking. He's equipped with like good pencils.
He's got the great pencils.
He's got all the stuff, right? But it just goes and goes. It goes
on
for like 3 pages, right?
Look at the language on 125. Pribislav looked at him with his Kyrgyz eyes above the prominent cheekbones and spoke in his pleasantly husky voice.
Yeah.
So I just made a note, like on both pages 92 and 118, Shawkut's voice has specifically been referred to as husky.
Exactly.
So Thomas Mann would neither be the first nor the last thinker to connect a husky voice with sexy.
Right.
Like that's just something people think is sexy, whether it's like homo, hetero, trans, pan, whatever. A voice can do it. And, the huskiness of his voice, without any surprise, with pleasure, he said, but you must be sure to give it me back after the period. And drew his pencil out of his pocket. And so, and then even the word screwed, and I don't know if that's a purposeful translation or how that works in German, but one screwed in order to make the red lead pencil come out.
Right.
And so I'm like, damn, that is some seriously sexual memory that you're having.
Thinking, and again, it's a bit on the nose, right?
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of those kind of like Russ Meyer movies, right, where like you get the extreme close up of the lipstick coming out.
Yes.
And it feels it just feels like it just immediately is turned to 11.
Yes.
I mean, I'm really startled. By this, and in some ways, I kind of felt myself thinking like, okay, you've earned all. We had to do this. We had to like go to this place of nothingness in order for this to reemerge,
right?
On some level, and so I kind of felt like, okay, if this is where we're going with this, that this is this kind of like heart of darkness journey up his repressed memories, that he's going to sort of have this discovery of this like much more complex, sort of sense of whatever this is, then this might become this sort of Jamesian thing that I could get behind, instead of just this kind of dull enumeration of like life in the sanatorium.
And I mean, do you believe that this connects to his dislike of work? Even though he has a conservative worldview, he kept saying, and the narrator kept reminding us early on, he doesn't like to work. And I think part of it is when he's busy, he's not able to I think he's more comfortable in confusion in some ways than in clarity. Like laid back here with a nosebleed, away from the world of shipbuilding, away from the world of inheritances. It's like, do I like dudes or not?
Yeah.
Is really what he wants to think about, right? Like the most. Is that fair?
It doesn't take him long.
Yeah.
To get to this place.
Yeah. It's much more interesting than clocking in,
Right, but also, right, I mean, this is, I'm reminded of, is it the Chinese insult or the Chinese curse that, may you live in interesting times.
Right.
The this idea that, like, interesting, yes, but also it comes with some baggage.
Yes.
I mean, it becomes kind of it becomes a problem at the same time. And,
maybe this is a really overheated way of saying that Hans is a daydreamer. And that the novel in some ways might be about what it means to be a daydreamer,
or that there's just more to him in some sense.
Yeah.
That everything has been so kind of like programmed and pragmatic, and and he's had this kind of path charted, that he in a way it's a classic story, right? Young dude thinks he's got it all figured out, on the brink of stepping into this kind of successful slot. I'm thinking Pretty Woman.
Sure.
I mean, it's not exactly
right.
Richard.
Secret of My Success might be a better.
Maybe, yeah. But this idea that something can come along and usually it's some kind of romantic entanglement that just shatters your worldview and forces you to reconsider all these things that you thought you had figured out.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I'm a huge fan of.
Right. That's a good way of doing literature.
Well, and it feels kind of real to me in this in the sense that that this kind of Kuhnian paradigm shift is, I think, feels true to life to me. I guess.
Absolutely.
I won't presume how.
Well, nothing will fuck up your worldview more than being attracted to somebody. Like one minute you're going to work and doing your business, and the next minute you're like, "Is it too soon to call her?"
Right.
And that's just not, the same thing.
And this is complicated enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then throw into this mix, like, am I attracted to her because she reminds me of this boy?
Right, right.
Which that's a question you got to sit down on.
Yeah, you gotta, nosebleed or not.
You gotta kind of weigh that one. And so I think this is a really interesting moment, and I think it's especially interesting for me in concert with this lecture that Krukowski gives towards the end. He's gotten this nosebleed while he's doing his proper walk, right? Let me roll back for a second, right?
Yeah.
We open up. He's buying these blankets because he's in Rome, as Settembrini says,
yes.
right? And he's got to, and the weather's changed, and he's got to do this balcony thing. But then, what seems like a few hours later, he's like, "Screw this noise! I'm going to sneak off. I'm going to skip second breakfast, and I'm going to have a proper walk." Right. And it's in the midst of all this that he gets this memory of the boy from high school or whatever, and then he's got to get a ride back because he is supposed to attend this lecture, And I think it's really interesting that one of the things that this does without...
And this is after the dance, right?
Yeah,
so the action of today's reading is paced by... First there's a sexy dance.
Right.
Then there's the walk.
Interrupted by this political rant from
Settembrini.
Yeah.
It says that music is like politically corrupt.
Right. I don't do it on a schedule.
Yeah. And then there's the walk. Mm-hmm. Then there's the lecture. Then there's Hans recovering from the lecture, and that's pretty much covers today's.
Yeah, with a couple little odds and ends. Like I think it's interesting that they pay a bill.
Right.
Like that relieved me.
Yeah.
Like,
I was like, we're doing business.
So they do charge money.
Yes.
Because it seemed like there was no discussion of that.
I actually like that they're charging money, even though because for one thing, I think he's making fun of it. I don't have the page number, but he's like, the way Germans always get so somber when they do business, I thought was a direct slam on his former countryman.
Yeah.
Mon, that is. Also, though, maybe current at the time in 1924, but also, it's just relieving to me because I know that, or at least it makes me feel more confident that this place isn't going to turn into like Oregon State Hospital in Cuckoo's Nest.
Right.
I know that if they stop paying, they will have to leave.
Right. Exactly.
There's something, it makes it feel less of a. Although I guess if you're legitimately sick, you're trapped by having to pay. I don't know, but it feels less like a horror novel. The fact that there are bills to pay, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's also interesting to me that Hans gets this bill, and part of it is for treatment.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, I'm not getting that, but fair enough.
Right.
And there's
I could have.
There's this kind of interesting bit of foreshadowing, I imagine, that he's getting treated, right?
Yeah.
And the question is sort of like, what is the nature of this treatment?
That's right.
And does it matter that he doesn't understand that he's receiving treatment? Just by living in this place, and I think this is pretty. But you're right that really it's the ball and the lecture. For me,
and then the dinner with Madame Engelhart, who picks on him for having a crush on Shellcott.
Yeah,
they play this game.
Yeah, the gossipy.
They play this game where she's like, I don't know why you can't stop talking about her, and he's like both offended but can't help himself.
Well, it's that kind of like flirty, thing where and you get the feeling that they're just entertaining themselves. In a way, it's just what bored people do.
Right.
And it's also a way for him to talk about this without necessarily putting his cards actually on the table.
Right.
It allows this kind of filter of irony.
You need that sometimes when you're feeling intense feelings. Yeah.
Yeah. So. But for me, I think today's reading really bookends around the concert and then the lecture.
Yeah.
And the sort of I'm blanking on the word that I want to use. It'll occur to me in a minute. But the sort of just pragmatic movement of character, exposition is the word.
Yeah.
The sort of exposition that gets us from event to event there. Which is not unimportant, but it seems like the real landmarks are these things. And the lecture really stands out to me.
Yeah. I thought so too. The lecture seems to be, how would you say, is it like an argument for chastity while in this place?
I think it's something else.
Okay.
I'm not quite prepared to say exactly what, but But so he's talking about the power of love, right? On 129, you know, and you know, he gets there a little late. Everybody kind of scolds him.
Right.
You know, the great doctor is about to speak.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, just, you know, much like I'm sure our students feel as they...
Or when we go to conferences.
As they rush in, you know. Well, I'm thinking more of, you know, the great respect that our students bring.
Oh,
you
right,
know,
yes.
The punctuality and the seriousness. And so he rushes in and he sits down in the back. And then he's completely distracted for what feels like not a short amount of time. You know,
by show cut.
Right, he's staring at, you know, and you're wondering about all this stuff. And then he has to sort of force himself to come back to the moment. And around 129 where he says, and what was Dr. Krukowski saying?
Yes.
What was this line of thought? And he said, it was about power. The power which, in short, it was about the power of love. Right? Yes, of course, the subject was already given out in the general title. Right? And you know, he's kind of going on about it. In particular, just a few lines down, in particular, the speaker employed the word love in a somewhat ambiguous sense so that you were never quite sure where you were with it, or whether he had reference to its sacred or its passionate and fleshly aspect. And this doubt gave one a slightly seasick feeling. And this is, of course,
I underlined that too.
This is exactly where Hans is.
Yes.
You know, in general, you know, and it is right. You know, this is a very recognizable sort of confusion, right? Like, what are we talking about here? You know?
Yeah.
I like to. I forget the specific context that I use this in, but I have a lesson. It must be some sort of Carpe Diem poem or something like that. But I have a lesson where I like to emphasize to my students the phrase is fall in love.
Yeah.
Right. We don't. You know, this is not a decision. This is not a well-reasoned thing. You know, the way we, you know, it could be, but the way that we fashion it in our language is as this thing that's out of your control that I assume comes with that feeling I get when the elevator goes down a little too fast.
Yes.
And this is exactly, you know, where Hans is.
Yeah.
Now, whether this is love exactly, I mean, I think he's on point here to say like is this love or
is it lust?
You know,
what is
am
it?
I just ostensibly he's a virgin. You know, I mean, he seems.
I feel this way too. Yes.
You know, he seems not to be, you know, experienced. But then Krukowski goes on, right, in 3031, right. He seems to be criticizing society, right. About 2/3 of the way down 130, we are driven by sheer force of logic to this conclusion, right, which is that perversity, you know, the power of love could lead to perversity.
Right.
Dr. Krukowski implored his hearers, having arrived at it, to hold it fast. Now, there were psychical correctives, forces working in the other direction. Instincts tending to conformability and regularity. He would almost have likened to characterize them as bourgeoisie, and these influences had the effect of merging the perverse components into a valid and irreproachable whole. So this is an old argument, right?
Yeah.
This is Hobbes to some extent, right? That like left to our own devices, you know, we're just dirty monkeys.
Yeah.
And if it weren't for the superstructure of society, you know, keeping us in check, we would just, you know,
so that we can sublimate all our impulses.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, that we would just play with ourselves all day instead of like building culture.
Right.
Or whatever. Right. And so this seems to be, you know, kind of an ordinary, you know, and for the record, I will say I don't really subscribe to this. I think that this is a.
It's overly simplistic.
Yeah, there's something there, but Krukowski kind of also seems to complicate it, right? Because as he says, but on the other hand, right, just a couple lines further, there were cases where this result was not obtained. This good merger of the two, right? And
could not and should not be obtained.
Right. And for in these cases, the two opposing groups of instincts, the compulsive force of love and the sum of the impulses urging in the other direction, among which he would particularly mention shame and disgust, both exhibited an extraordinary and abnormal height and intensity when measured by the ordinary bourgeoisie standards, and the conflicts between them, which took place in the abysses of the soul, prevented the erring instincts from attaining to that safe, sheltered, and civilized state. So there's a problem with this, right? The equation doesn't always balance out, right? Love was suppressed, held in darkness and chains by fear, conventionality, aversion, or a tremulous yearning to be pure. I love this tremulous yearning to be
pure.
This unnatural desire to avoid whatever this potential contamination could be, right? And so what happens there is this is where sickness comes from. The suppressed love. And now we're kind of back into incel territory.
Yeah.
Right? The suppressed love, right? And I think this is like a few generations back, but this is essentially the blue balls argument. Right?
Yeah, it is.
The suppressed love creates illness. This is the root of, we're almost back to Socrates. This is the root of illness.
Yeah.
And I think
the symptoms of disease are nothing but a disguised manifestation of the powers of love, and all disease is only love transformed.
Right.
You could almost say that he's making an argument for hedonism.
Or something closer to that. Right?
Yeah.
He does seem interested in balance.
Yeah.
He doesn't want,
He doesn't want it to turn into a frat party at the sanatorium.
Right.
Although there are suggestions that he's having his own relations with a lot of the women residents.
But he's being discreet.
Yeah, he is.
Ish.
Yes, yes.
And I suspect, like all of us, he thinks the way he's doing it is the right way.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that this is even going to be part of his bit.
Yeah.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that 100, 200 pages from now, we're going to just sort of be entertained by a seduction scene where he's like, now you don't want to get sick, do you?
Right.
You've got to let a little bit of it out.
Yeah.
And I'm a doctor,
Well, and then he bounces from that back to what I keep noticing is the fetishization of Shaukat. So
yeah.
He's into her, but he's always into her parts in a way that I think is really striking and Freudian. On the top of 132, floating right out of what you just said, his thoughts were soon drawn off again by the sight of Frau Schaukat's back and the arm appertaining, which was lifting and bending itself so that the hand could hold the braids of hair. All these, the hand, the braids, the back.
Right.
It made him uncomfortable to have the hand so close beneath his eye, to be forced to look at it, whether he wished or no, to study it in all its human blemishes and imperfections, as though under a magnifying glance. No, there was nothing aristocratic about this stubby schoolgirl hand with the badly cut nails. He was even not quite sure that the ends of the fingers were perfectly clean and the skin around the nails was distinctly bitten. And then a little bit further down, the arm, in its gentle upward curve, was better than the hand. It was scarcely close. And then he finishes that paragraph. It was at once both full and slender, in all probability cool to the touch. He wants to touch her arm.
Yeah.
No, not as far as the arm went. The idea about counteracting bourgeois influences did not apply. So I believe it is his baser instincts warring with his bourgeoisie instincts in the way that the doctor's talking about. He's connecting all of this to just pieces of Shaukat's body. So what do you make of that? Like his sort of dissection of her?
Well, I think it's not an accident that 3 or 4 lines past where you stop there, we come back to that section about this inward disease.
Yeah.
And I think in the fullness of the conversation, one of the things that this kind of hints at is this suggestion that Hans thinks that he is maybe inwardly diseased.
And then maybe part of that is his sexual desires. Yeah. Whether it's attraction to men or women or both. Whatever it is.
That there's this discomfort with the internal and external not lining up the way he wants it to, these different values, perhaps. I also think that there's just, it's an oversimplification, but I think it's a problem. He has a problem with women.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that he's a terrible human being. It maybe isn't entirely his fault.
And he might change over the course of the book. Yeah.
But for the moment, there's this kind of horror movie kind of dissection happening that I find sort of problematic. We'll just say. Now, this is not to say that this can't blossom into something that he might actually learn. That I mean, I have to say I would be pretty pleased if part of the project of this novel is to sort of rehabilitate this guy into a kind of fuller sense of what the woman he's interested in could be,
right?
Or something like that. But this also sets us up for what I think is an almost pratfall style punchline on 135, which I just think is great. Krukowski finishes the lecture in this pose that Hans likens to Christ on the cross.
Yes.
Right. And he's like, come to me for psychoanalysis.
Yes.
On the cross. And I know this type, and I know you do too, right? I've seen too many conference presentations that are just like all charisma and no research.
Right.
And it feels like that's kind of what's going on here. It's a little bit like a timeshare spiel, in that sense that he's drumming up business.
Yes.
The point of the lecture is to sort of make people wonder if they have this inward suppression.
Right.
And what am I going to do about it?
And Hans wonders on 133. He watched Frau Schalkut going out, gliding along with her head thrust forward. Did she have herself psychoanalyzed? He wondered, and his heart began to thump.
Right.
So,
yeah. But then just a little further along, there's this great moment where he watches everybody following the doctor out, and he invokes the Pied Piper, and then he remembers that he's just a guest, and he goes, "Thank God I'm healthy. That business has nothing to do with me."
Yes.
And I kind of found myself wishing, and I guess this brings us back to the beginning a little bit. I kind of find myself wishing there had been a sort of editor with like glasses in mouth to go, Thomas, stop chapter right there.
Yes. Because that's
really
funny.
This is really it,
Yeah.
This he has spent the entire day sort of facing all of
everything Krukowski's
stuff,
talking about,
right? And then he's like, "Well, at least I don't have to worry about it."
Yes.
And it's this perfect illustration, I think, of the really, I mean, in some ways, the really, really problematic kind of repression that goes along with this kind of bourgeois like normalness, but there's also this kind of humor that this is Polonius behind the arras, right? That we know he's going to have to confront this before the book's over. And
it ends even with today's reading the way it ended. I mean, for him, I actually thought this was well done. The last few sentences on 145 at the top. For now, he need not feel that it so beat of its own accord. And he's now feeling his own heartbeat. So he's got this problem now too, on top of all the other. Without sense or reason or any reference to his non-corporeal part, he could say without stretching the truth that such a connection now existed or was easily induced. He was aware that he felt an emotion to correspond with the action of his heart. He needed only to think of Madame Schalkut, and he did think of her. And lo, he felt within himself the emotion proper to the heartbeats.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, I think this is a very circumlocucious way of saying, okay, he's into her.
Right.
And to your point, overly written. An overly written way of saying, okay, so as he laid down, he couldn't stop thinking about her, and instead, but it's true that, true isn't the right word. It makes sense that now the physical sound and texture of his own heartbeat would be another symptom now. There's the nose bleeding, the head shaking, the heart beating now, the coughing up blood. He's just got a lot of problems, and fortunately, money ain't one, but he's got the other ones.
One of the things that occurs to me all at once, now that you say it that way, is in a weird way, right? He's dissecting himself the same way that he's dissecting her.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, he's breaking himself down in these ways.
Organs, and these kinds of things. It's a little bit like Ignatius Reilly and his valve.
Right.
He's sort of diagnosing himself by the function of these things.
Yes.
And so I think there's a, I mean, in a way, like maybe I'm a little bit. Maybe I'm passing judgment a little too soon, because there's a sweetness in the potential right. I mean, in a way, this is a coming of age story, or could be a coming of age story. And there's a sweetness there, and a little bit of fumbling, a little bit of sort of narrative meandering.
I mean,
might be.
What's interesting about literature that we try to talk to our students about, right, is that like sometimes it's more than one thing. And so yes, there is the hint of more than a little bit of misogyny going on, and yes, we can unpack some of this in terms of ableism, the way we're talking about diseased people, and we can certainly do a Freudian reading with fetishism and with carving people up into their parts. But there also is this intensely relatable feeling of when you realize you're into somebody, you're trying to go to sleep and you can't.
Right.
Like that's, maybe part of what makes this literature with a big L is that it's able to make us have this conversation we've had for the last hour, that it made us think about all those different things, heavy-handed though it might be.
Well, and part of that is this very kind of modernist, function of defamiliarizing that otherwise very familiar, kind of thing that is itself a kind of fetishization, right?
Yeah.
That it's carving out this experience from its context and moving it somewhere else, and maybe that's part of why this so much of this has been the saga of getting where he's going, is to sort of really sort of hit a bass drum on this idea that this is familiar but not, in this sense. And I'm reminded of that thing. At least TV surgeons do, right, where they cover the body with sheets except for the one little area that they're cutting. Presumably to kind of alter the context of the action. So I think there's certainly some stuff going on. I am missing. I'm wishing that maybe Mann had met Hemingway.
Which he might have, but probably not
early on.
Yeah.
And like, maybe I should try this.
Try some iceberg, buddy.
Maybe short sentences or something. But
it's also odd to us, I think, in 2022 to read something so unapologetically influenced by Freudian thinking. Like it's really been a long time since I read something like that, where it was like not ironic about it, not like like the way even by the time I got to grad school, that was one of the theories, psychoanalytical reading. But even then, like every professor I had was always like, but this is less interesting than new historicism or feminism or race theory, like.
Well, and it's in the full flush of the moment.
Yeah.
It really, I think in some ways it really thinks that this is the answer to everything.
Yes.
In a way that we can't feel.
We can't. I mean, we and it's kind of interesting in a way though to go back and like be like, wow, people really did storytell this way, and hopefully it will heat up. I think you're right that part of it is just the meticulousness that he admitted in the foreword has gotten to us a little bit.
Yeah.
And like I don't mind a long book, and neither do you. Obviously, we part of why we picked this is because it's so big, But what we want is some sense of, I think, purpose for the length, right? Like that it be the length because it's dense. With more stuff than we've gotten so far.
Well, I mean, it has all these characters.
Yeah.
And I don't care about them. And this is maybe my shortcoming.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they seem to be scenery more than these kind of full
realized
psychological.
Even Joachim, it's like he likes military apparel.
Yeah.
Well,
and this speaks, I guess, to that Freudian thing that you were just talking about. But so much of it seems to be kind of like superstructure for this like symbolic order.
Yeah.
That I'm just not. I don't know. Maybe this is just a matter of taste, but I'm not so impressed by that.
Yeah.
As I was maybe when I was 17 or 18. And was like, oh wow, this whole thing is about something else, and I was like, well, just say so then, man.
It's interesting to think about a book this long maybe being more of a young person's book.
Right.
That's an interesting way to think about it. I was reading on Facebook the other yesterday. A friend of mine was complaining. She goes to a Books We're Reading Now podcast and uses that as a way to like figure out what to read next. It's one of her resources. And somebody who was an adult said something about being able to relate to Holden Caulfield on the podcast, and it really bothered my friend. She was like, and understandably so. She was like, like you can't be like in your 40s talking about how you relate to Holden Caulfield. Like, what are you doing, man? Kind of an argument. And maybe this book has some of that. Like, maybe this is more about being young than we're able to fully wrap our brains around.
I mean, Hans Castorp is in his 20s. Mm-hmm. But...
So he's not Holden's age.
But he's a young 20.
Yeah, he's a young 20.
I think. And maybe this is just kind of what middle-class German life was like.
Yeah.
I really have no idea.
Right.
The cultural mores or whatever, but this he feels like somebody really 5 years younger than I think he is in this case. I mean, I think this is his first experience of like genuine sexual desire.
Yes.
And maybe,
I mean, unless we're counting the schoolyard crush, but
right. Yeah, but it feels like this is his first kind of like real real moment where he I mean, I may be reading too much into it, but I think he's actually considering sleeping with her.
Right.
And and it seems like, I mean, not to sound like a creeper, but it seems like a little late for that. I'm not trying to suggest that there's a clock on it for everybody, but it does seem like okay, so what's it mean that this is where you're at, in your
early 20s. He says he's 24. He says he's 24.
Yeah. And so, what's that really mean about, I mean, does it mean that you're just, super disciplined and super focused and, you've been, what
religiously chaste,
or what do they say, like on social media, like I'm focused on my career,
right?
Or obviously could be, but the idea that this sensation is so fresh and so new to him is really,
that's interesting.
Like it's interesting, but at the same time, it's also kind of like, I don't know. In a way, it feels a little bit cheap to me. It's we're this guy's going to have a sexual awakening, now here, that involves this event from 10 years ago, and somehow, like all he thought about between the two things was shipbuilding.
It reminds me a little bit when you put it that way. I don't know if you saw the 40-year-old version with Steve Carell. But that was, similar, right?
Really?
Like he had a series of just disturbing and failed efforts with women when he was young. And he just like kind of gave up and went into his own world.
Yeah.
And, like just did his thing until he was 40.
I mean,
and then he has a sexual awakening in the movie, and it's Judd Apatow, so it's stupid.
Right.
But it also has some interesting kind of depth and commentary going on along the way.
Right.
But either way, that being said, how far shall we go next time?
I was just looking at mine, and chapter 4 ends on page 189.
It's
which
not
is
bad.
About 50 pages.
Yeah.
And I think given, the various obstacles, and sort of calendar events,
I think we can do that in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think that would, and that would put us in a sort of moment. I haven't really looked past that, but let's see, when we get into chapter 5. This is a cheap shot in a way, but I'm annoyed at the convention of author and book title on the headers.
Yeah.
I really think it should be chapters.
Yeah.
Because nobody flips through the book like this to be reminded that it's Thomas Mann. We're all looking for where the next chapter
That's
starts.
right. That's